Doom 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 doom. Doom 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 doom. We didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world's been. Okay, I'm sorry about that intro, ladies and gentlemen. Something you guys are gonna have to bear in mind with me a little bit is that it is Valentine's Day, and here I am sitting in my little room, literally doing a video called "Chris and Reality: A Quickie Reading." I mean, it's not going to be quick. You need to see just how much there is to this. Also, for the fact that, to be honest, I think this is just more fun as I slowly slip into that sort of sad period of my life where the only thing that can give me comfort is reciting Billy Joel songs. So, there you are. What else do I have to say? So, yes, health disclosure, just before we get going. This article contains in-depth discussion of Chris's physical and or mental health. This page is not to be construed as a substitute for medical advice or a professional diagnosis. All diagnoses are either taken from outside documentation or based on amateur analysis. Chris, December 2016, in a rare moment of self-awareness on his habit of escapism. You can only escape in your mental depths and recluse for so long before you are pulled back into reality, and too many things leave you feeling like you get little peace at home. That's actually quite profound for Chris, considering that we know fine well, because evidence of the fact that barely Chris ever leaves his house, is that he eventually has to realize that no matter how easy it is to escape from the hell of your own life, the only way you're ever going to get out of hell is through your own efforts. Now, let's get started, shall we? And this might possibly be the sad reality of Chris's world, where this is what he believes to be real because it's far more tangible than the sad reality that is his life. Sad but true, but a lot of that is also Chris's making, but we'll wait and see. Do you guys think I'm a little bit harsh when I'm saying that all of this was Chris's doing and that was there anything else that could have been his fault? I mean, yes, there are, but how much does that want to play? It's you decide. Reality is a concept that Chris desperately tries to avoid acknowledging, instead retreating to the comfort of his imaginary world and hoping that reality will eventually bend to his whims. Many people with autism struggle to distinguish between reality and fantasy, but most make an effort to reduce the impact on their lives. I will admit, and usually sometimes, okay, to be honest, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes my fantasies sort of get in the way of me whenever I am not working and I can just sort of relax and just breathe, touch grass and breathe in the air. And as fun as it is, sometimes I feel like almost at the stage where I can't really turn it off because I'm trying to make the fantasies into reality, and it needs consideration and planning and effort. Some of which is, it's not so much that the thought of doing it is overwhelming, but the scale of success is more overwhelming, probably even more than failure, because you can succeed from failure, but you can't really succeed from succeeding. You can only do better, if that makes sense. Chris, on the other hand, embraces his realm of fantasy, especially as escapism from stress, life responsibilities, and his bleak future. What little there is, unfortunately, left, I should say. Trapping himself in a feedback loop whereby his real-world life and issues are further neglected while his devotion to his fantasies gets stronger. Notably, Chris believes that Quickville and his imaginary friends are real. Chris has been spotted conversing, interacting, and dancing with them on many occasions, and even believes that he is married to imaginary people. Chris also holds delusions of grandeur, from believing he has the power to curse people, to thinking he has psychic powers, and even believing he is a goddess, with the power to unite entire dimensions, and that this dimensional merge would make him rich and bring his fictional characters and those of others to life. So far, it's not really going according to plan. At least what Chris thinks, anyway. Chris's perception of reality has been on a downward spiral for most of his life, due to a lifetime of being coddled by his parents. Following the death of his father in 2011, and amid the increasing infirmity of his mother, Chris was forced into shouldering more responsibilities than he was mentally ill-equipped to bear, and consequently, he invested more heavily in magical beliefs as solutions to the problems presented by reality. In 2017, the idea guys, trolls, who utilized role-playing as Chris's imaginary friends, further exasperated Chris's grasp of reality, giving validation to his fantasies and encouraging him to stay rooted in his fantasy world, a trend continued at present day by waves of enablers. And you see right here, no wonder Chris has to make this so big, because he needs to know, well, this could have been, I like to imagine this could have been blocking a window to the outside world. But no, this is his outside world now, and his inside. Chris maintains his beliefs even in the face of mental health professionals. For 9 months between summer of 2018 and spring of 2019, he was required to see a psychiatrist and therapy group at Region 10 and told them of his beliefs of his imaginary friends and multiple dimensions, to which their reaction was to simply hand-wave him through their program. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if, there's ever going to be any sort of, inquiry about these sorts of failings, but there's going to be a bigger inquiry as to just how much we've got to cover. I mean, look at this. This is the contents, right? The causes of Chris's poor grips on reality, the consequences, the difference between the fantasy and fiction, and what goes on in the real world. So, with that much to go through, let's go, shall we? Causes of Chris's poor grip on reality. Parental enabling. Although autism is one major factor, his parents contributed a lot towards Chris's wall perception of anyone or anything that antagonizes him. Bob and Barbara regularly fed Chris conciliatory platitudes about how he was mistreated out of jealousy, and that special rules exist for the benefit of autistic people. The platitudes cemented Chris's all-pervasive sense of entitlement, and there was enough of it already going around, as well as his indiscriminate belief that anything bad that happened to him was a conspiracy, whether or not it was caused by his stupidity or stubbornness. Most probably too, for once again, Chris's lack of interaction with the outside world would suggest that, well, what was going on in the inside world had probably made more impact than we care to know. Psychological problems. The only known formal diagnoses of Chris are autism, dating from when he was 5 or 6 years old, and gender dysphoria, officially diagnosed in 2016. However, his behavior in adulthood suggests he has undiagnosed issues. Chris exhibits signs of maladaptive daydreaming, a psychiatric disorder comprised of vivid daydreams and excessive fantasies that can interfere with socializing or even replace it altogether. This behavior is observed in Chris with his imaginary friends and Quickville, the dimensional merge, and especially the polyamorous marriage. Maladaptive daydreaming is also associated with pacing and musical stimulation. Eyewitnesses' accounts of Chris, such as The Tale of the Crazy Pacer, mention these behaviors in him. Chris also stated that music from his phone is his method for meditation. Well, if that's what he wants to call it, anyway. Now, we have to move on to the trickier subject of Peter Pan syndrome, which is a pop psychological term to describe those who are immature and refuse to grow up and accept adult responsibilities. Now, once again, ladies and gentlemen, you could make the case it's not so much Chris didn't want to grow up, but simply put, he didn't think he could anymore. Which is actually really disparaging when you think about it, because from what I understand about this is that Chris probably still could, but I think the situation he is in right now is incredibly comforting and comfortable to him. And what sense does it make for someone in Chris's position to give up something comfortable? Not much, I'm afraid. Chris has demonstrated this with his refusal to seek work, instead begging for money or ignoring his debt payments to afford more toys. An eyewitness to one of Chris's debt hearings noted that Chris was trying hard to revert to childhood, based on how he made childish noises during his time in the courtroom and talked back to his mother in a childlike voice. The dimensional merge represents Chris's ultimate desire to hide from adult responsibilities, as he believes it will grant his wildest power fantasies and enable him to continue living like a child. Chris's devotion to rejecting adult life has warped his perception of reality, as he spends all his free time playing make-believe as if it were a religion. A common theory since the dimensional merge saga unfolded is that Chris may have schizophrenia. This is actually something that I firmly believe in, ladies and gentlemen, if for no other reason than Chris exhibits in later years, his mannerisms, his little mini outbursts, sometimes when he tries to look at the camera and his eyes are not looking in the same place, or that he just, even when he's for seconds at a time, he just looks as though he's looking in two different directions. It's either schizophrenia or something more severe, and maybe the term doesn't exist yet. Maybe it's some delayed seizure of some sort. Based on his rantings about his imaginary world, seeming as if he cannot distinguish between reality and fantasy, however, a closer look at Chris's ramblings show that he's capable of discerning the difference, when he chooses to, that is, but couches it in the belief of different dimensions to preserve his escapist fantasies. Unlike a schizophrenic, Chris will distinguish between reality, or as he calls it, 1218, and his fantasy domain named C197. So, it's sort of a looser one, you could say. Damn Dimension 1218's reality limits and shit. Chris's reaction when reality's dimension and his fantasy dimension did not merge as predicted. 1st of January 2019 was meant to be the year. A prime example of him being able to differentiate reality from his escapist fantasies. Though not fully doable on the 1218 side of the dimensional curtain yet, I am able to draw up a water to wine conversion and vice versa. Yes, Chris. So, in case you're thinking that Chris's Jesus complex didn't come about any sooner, well, there's your answer. Chris showing he is aware he doesn't have superpowers in reality. Also, unlike a schizophrenic, Chris's fantasies do not involve paranoia or hallucinations and are entirely self-serving. While Chris has made statements implying he is hallucinating, such as when he insists he can see or interact with his imaginary friends, he often omits that he uses techniques such as meditation or astral projection, read simple imagination, another indicator that this is maladaptive daydreaming. I mean, listen, it's all well and good for a while, but you've got to wake up at some point, and Chris doesn't really want to do that. I've had to commute to here, Dimension C197, via astral projection. The tough part is having to leave my body in 1218. Oh, but very soon I shall finally be able to bring my body here to C197. Chris giving a rare explanation on how he delves into his fantasy world. As you do. Chris's behavior and beliefs, however, align at least something somewhat with schizotypal personality disorder. Something I've literally never heard of, even to this video. So let's see, schizotypal personality disorder. Also known as SPD. We'll just call it, is a cluster, a cluster A personality disorder. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, classification describes the disorder specifically as a personality disorder, categorized by thought disorder, paranoia, a characteristic form of social anxiety, derealization, transient psychosis, and unconventional beliefs. People with this disorder feel pronounced discomfort in forming and maintaining social connections with other people, primarily due to the belief that their people harbor negative thoughts and views about them. Peculiar speech mannerisms and social unexpected modes of dress are also characteristic. Schizotypal people may react oddly in conversations, not respond or talk to themselves. They frequently interrupt situations as being strange or having unusual meanings for them. Paranormal and superstitious beliefs are common. Schizotypal people usually disagree with the suggestion that their thoughts and behaviors are a disorder and seek medical attention for depression or anxiety instead. That Chris does. Schizotypal personality disorder occurs in approximately 3% of the general population and is more commonly diagnosed in males. That does kind of sound like Chris in many ways, but whether he's actually, we know fine well because he's never ever been tested for, things like reality testing, schizophrenia, or even schizotypal. So make of that what you will. Is this something, what do you guys think? Should Chris be tested for schizophrenia? Which is thought to exist on a spectrum with schizophrenia, him matching at least 6 of the 9 diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5. Ideas of reference, believing that certain general innocuous events hold something special or messages for oneself. Strange beliefs or magical thinking that influences behavior and is inconsistent with subcultural norms. Abnormal perceptual experiences, including bodily illusions. Suspiciousness or paranoid ideation. Strange behavior or appearance. Or excessive social anxiety that does not diminish with familiarity and tends to be associated with paranoid fears rather than negative judgments about self. Whilst Chris was largely comfortable around his paid-for companions during high school, his interaction with both the fairer sex and the pickle bearers have since been riddled with paranoid fears and delusions. At least 3 symptoms, however, namely strange thinking and speech, lack of close friends, inappropriate or constricted affects. Whilst also present in Chris, can be almost exclusively attributed to his autism, much like his narcissism. Also, schizotypal individuals generally do not develop the grandiose delusions he has developed over the years and are generally reclusive. So further digging than internet armchair analysis is required, which Chris, of course, will likely never receive, thanks to his adamant refusal to seek out help voluntarily or benefit from professional help that is forced upon him. Lack of grounding in the real world, which is something that when you get straight to the point, that's the reason why none of these theories or dimensional merge conspiracy crackpots ever hold up, because there's too many questions about them. Chris's lack of purpose, combined with his enormous ego, further fuels his disconnection from reality, compelling him to instead seek out the purpose with make-believe, such as being the mayor of Quickville and being the goddess CPU Blueheart. Since the government provides for him with the monthly tugboat, along with money from financial enablers, and his parents always provide a roof over his head. Chris has never had an incentive to get a job without the structure that a job, even a minimum wage job or volunteer position, would impart to him. Chris is instead free to wallow in his fantasies. Chris' hobbies are mostly limited to Netflix, video games, YouTube, and Twitter. Despite supposedly having a call for art, he rarely draws like he used to. While video games can stimulate the brain, his hobbies leave little room for creativity or substantial self-improvement. Even a simple hobby like photography would be a big step up from Chris's current avocations, which just goes to show how bad things really must be sinking for him if even that's completely out of the question. Chris rarely leaves his room, instead preferring to daydream for 3 to 6 hours a day. That you can't do that and literally just go about your business. That's you had almost the brain power to conjure up an entire a 300-page essay or even a 300-page book in that time. And you're telling me he can't do anything sincere or serious with that? When he does socialize, it is mainly on his terms, role-playing with enablers who keep him invested in his fantasies or appearing at conventions with fans who treat him as a celebrity. Chris describing his day-to-day life. As for what I do while awake on the recent, I get up, take my meds, meditate while playing Tetris 99 to at least take on the daily tasks for the game. Most days I go out on an errand or simply walking. Anyway, during the time at home, I tend to binge a show, do some drawing or creative work, namely the TSSSF cards and the comic pages. None of which he probably thinks were required that he was being paid to do. Which is another thing as well, is that you want to talk about some of the more devious sides of the things that Chris does. You do know that, well, he doesn't actually, pay or, meet his obligations, because that's another thing that would drag Chris back into, like, reality immediately. Because when it's a question of money involved, is that it's something that Chris has, like, one of two attitudes about, with how it conflicts with his perception of reality. The first, and probably the most important of them, is that Chris seems very indifferent, apart from the fact that whenever he's ever short of any, he's almost constantly on the beg about them. And again, listen, if Chris had the initiative to literally, like, start a YouTube channel, or at least start something that he can actually monetize and do for himself, then it shouldn't be that difficult. I mean, Chris could probably start a new YouTube channel tomorrow, and it could be monetized literally in a matter of a couple of days. 4,000 weens would probably make sure they get it filled. Or they might probably do something trollish and literally delete their browser history, which would delete all the watch hours from Chris's, like, timeline. But I don't really think people are going to be, like, that vindictive or that stupid, because so many hundreds of people in that. Do you really think all of them are going to delete it? Anyway, escapist fantasies. Chris embraces his fantasies as escapism, overindulging in them to the point that his interest in them has largely eclipsed his real-world life. When his childlike lifestyle conflicts with his responsibilities associated with being an adult, Chris retreats to his fantasy realm to cope. This habit became especially prevalent in the years following the September 2011 death of his father, after which Chris found himself thrust into the world of adult responsibilities, as he had to do tasks such as pay his bills and help take care of his mother and pets. Chris was 29 years old when his father passed away. While most people would be accustomed to dealing with responsibilities by that age, Chris was unprepared for the burden since his parents had sheltered him up to that point, for example, until he died. His father had managed Chris's bank account due to his fiscal irresponsibilities. When my father was alive, I had more freedom. Now he has passed, I lost a lot of freedom and remained to take after the tasks he had left behind. You can only escape in your mental depths and recluse. So yeah, Chris lamenting over this, despite the fact that, again, why he never thought about, accepting more responsibilities before any of this happened, you tell me. It's a bit late now, Chris, to, like, say you knew this stuff, because you should have known this stuff when you were in your 20s, not when you're out of your 20s, if that makes sense. Chris occasionally whined on social media about his position in having to take care of his mother and pets, his statements gradually revealing more of his retreat into escapist fantasies. In September 2012, he complained, "Everybody else gets to go out and have a fun and a good time. I am stuck caregiving my mother and our dogs, and it is very stressful on me." Well, what do you think you've got? Why did you bother getting dogs in the first place for, Chris? They're your responsibility. That's as simple as that. You can't go on and complain about that. Why not take your dogs for an actual walk then? In January 2013, Chris was hoping for a sweetheart to rescue him from his life. "I need my sweetheart to make me happy. My heart hurts literally from my depression and loneliness. Serving my mother is not a final purpose to me, and my social life is very slim. I feel like I lack direction in my life as well." So yeah, whinging before, because, well, welcome to the real world, Chris. This is what happens when you decide not to do anything really for yourself. By summer of 2017, Chris was immersed in his escapism to the point that he was dancing with Magi-chan, one of his imaginary friends, at BronyCon. In October of that year, from his list of reasons for refusing to get a job, he half involved his devotion to his fantasies. I have a ton and shit ton of load of responsibilities and worries here at home, caretaking my mother, dogs, cats, and my own passion of my electric hedgehog Pokemon family. My city of Quickville, my own only me psychic connection to my family and friends there in that dimension, so I'll be darned if I do not already have enough on my plate. Well, no, just your dogs and, well, your pets and your mother. That's it, Chris. There's literally nothing else. You see, again, it's interesting as well that most people in this situation would learn to just sort of like exercise a sense of, trying to push this stuff out of your mind. But Chris like holds on to this as though it was his last right, is the last rights he would ever have. Chris's desire to be rescued from reality left him desperate for his fantasies to therefore be validated. His mentality similar to people willing to join cults. This led to Chris being exploited by a number of trolls, with the most infamous being the Idea Guys. Chris would only continue to retreat further and further into this elaborate alternative reality he has construed in his mind. While under arrest for sexually assaulting his elderly mother, Chris chose to ignore the seriousness of the situation he was in and gave a long spiel to the responding police officers about Sonichu, his status as a supreme goddess, and the dimensional merge. As Chris sits in prison, awaiting trial, free, sadly, so this part's going to need some work, he has now chosen to believe that he is also the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. And this literally walked onto his mind that to such an extent that when he was in the middle of a live stream, he spoke almost entirely without blinking and staring so deep into space that I don't even think Spock himself is going to come and save Chris. It's like, he stares and he's like, oh yeah, I'm Jesus Christ now. Make sure to follow Sonichu. He looked just about dead. Cult of the Idea Guys. I feel need to also thank them for adding more connection between our sister dimension and I. Chris on the Idea Guys retaining his cultist mentality several months after they had been ousted. On the 28th of October 2017, Joshua Wise, the first of a duo that would later be dubbed the Idea Guys, contacted Chris. Initially as an experiment to gauge Chris's gullibility, Wise began a plot to manipulate Chris into believing that Wise had made it into Quickville's dimension. Drawing from his experience in role-playing communities and borrowing lore from the video game and anime series Hyperdimension Neptunia, Wise crafted an elaborative narrative that included edited image graphics, doctored audio clips such as The Red Forest, and role-playing as Chris's imaginary friends. Chris, by this point in his life, desperate for his fantasies to be validated, eagerly accepted Wise's claims. The association between Wise and Chris morphed into cult leader and devout follower. Wise, taking advantage of Chris's desire for validation, brainwashed his beliefs on Quickville and his imaginary friends, such as by claiming Quickville to be occupied by Nazis, and that Rose Chew is a transgender woman, and that Chris is married to imaginary friends, with Chris accepting all of these things as facts. Which, it did always spawn an interesting question about whether or not anybody could have just come in and made anything they said canon in Sonichu, but it might literally be the case that anything can happen in these comics, for better or worse. And at some point, the second Idea Guy, Stephen Boyd, joined Wise. Together, the two exploited their influence over Chris and had him make false statements for blackmail purposes and con Chris into giving them thousands of dollars under threats they would destroy Quickville and release the blackmail material if he failed to comply. Their activities caught the attention of people in Chris's inner circle. who formed a group later termed the Guard Dogs to counteract the Idea Guys and remove them from power. However, even after the ousting, and through the Guard Dogs, though the Guard Dogs tried to encourage him to seek therapy at Region 10, Chris still retained most of the beliefs that the Idea Guys had brainwashed into him over the 6 months they were in power. Guard Dog Marvin explained Chris's perspective. Reality is a malleable concept to Chris. To Chris, that these losers were pretending to be imaginary characters doesn't mean they didn't unwittingly connect with their counterparts in the other dimension or whatever. So yeah, he thinks Wise and Boyd were assholes who stumbled upon some magic shit or some shit. Chris is mostly mad about money first and being made to embarrass himself second. In regards to why he still maintains a lot of that canon, however, it's because Chris is too invested in his imaginary world to give up on it so easily. I think after Wise and Boyd were outed, he felt really uncomfortable about retconning most of their changes. Because if he retcons the past 6 months, then fuck, why can't he retcon all of it? That would make him feel really uneasy about the possible reality of his imaginary world. That it is just that, it's an imaginary world. That reality is most important to him. Probably more than anything actually going on in the real world, which might even explain a lot. The post-Idea Guys era ignited a wave of enablers who sought to use the Idea Guys tactics to worm their way into Chris's life. For a few months, the Guard Dogs attempted to protect Chris by screening his messages for him. However, given Chris's refusal to address his psychological weaknesses and willingness to find others to play make-believe with, the enablers eventually broke past their defenses, leading to the Guard Dogs washing their hands of Chris. The Teen Troon Squad in fall of 2018, MKR Night V in winter 2019, Jacob Soklis in summer of 2019, and a myriad of other enablers took turns role-playing with Chris and enabling his fantasies in exchange for his attention. Because that seemed to be the only way to satisfy Chris, let alone anything else he would be bitching about. In addition, using lore brute forced into his head by the Idea Guys, Chris declared himself to be a CPU goddess, CPU Beluheart, and began to preach about the dimensional merge, further intensifying the cult vibes of his beliefs. Consequences. Beyond making a fool of himself, Chris's poor grasp of reality has compelled him to self-harm, fall for con men exploiting his beliefs and cause damage to his home. Late-onset gender dysphoria is a psychological disorder describing those who identify with another gender other than their own, and can present with the desire to be rid of their primary sex characteristics, and prefer those of the other gender. Like with everything else in his life, Chris sought out magical thinking to treat his gender dysphoria. In March 2016, he discovered subliminal frequency hypnosis videos, a collection of music tracks on YouTube claiming to, among other things, magically grant larger breasts and transform a penis into a vagina. Chris's confirmation bias over his breasts increasing, crediting it to the mysticism instead of his gynecomastia and poor measuring of his chest, led to him believe that the claims made by the channel were actually true. He pursued the penis-vagina transformation and began to prod his taint while under the impression there was a hidden vagina in there. Though the subliminal channel claimed the transformation would take 6 months, Chris eventually lost patience. In July 2016, he grabbed a knife and made a self-inflicted taint wound in an effort to free his vagina. Chris's devotion to the delusion was so potent that he initially resisted efforts by concerned fans to pressure him to going to the hospital, though he eventually wore down and admitted that it was a wound and obeyed treatment instructions. Chris nearly died because he preferred listening to his own beliefs than anything else. Con artists. While Chris has long been taken advantage of by trolls, isn't that obvious? The tactics and goals from the likes of the Idea Guys and Jacob Sockness surpassed the typical catfishing for content. The Idea Guys gradually built up a strong psychological hold over Chris by affirming his fantasies and playing along with them, to the point where Chris had full faith in anything they told him. They then used their influence to con Chris out of $6,000 by threatening to blow up Quickville with a moon laser if he failed to comply, manipulate him into punching his mother, and had him make videos slapping himself in the face and shitting on the floor. Things became even darker when the Idea Guys threatened to falsely report Chris as the P word to the FBI if he stopped supplying them with vast sums of money, consoles, and games, thus deepening the financial crisis. And all because Chris decided that he prefers Quickville over his own home. Jacob Sockness, however, following the example set by the Idea Guys, nearly succeeded in manipulating Chris into a sexual relationship, holding the dimensional merge over his head and faking a conversation with Chris's imaginary friend to convince him that they should meet and consider marriage. Though both the Idea Guys and Sockness were eventually ousted, by people countering their role-playing with their own, Chris had failed to learn and continues to leave the gates to his imaginary realm open to anyone who will validate his fantasies further. Property damage. My hands have punched that wall more than once in the past, yes, but it was part of the sequence of events at the time in practice of physically breaking the threads of the Iron Curtain veil. Chris, whatever that means. As of July 2021, a bathroom in the Chandler home has damage to the drywall from being punched in. Chris stated that he punched the wall in order to physically break the Iron Curtain, his term for a dimensional barrier between reality and his fantasy dimension of C-197. Whether you want to say Chris really went through with that, or whether or not he just did this out of anger and frustration is, well, to be honest, with the amount of rocks he's got around his neck now, I'm surprised he didn't just fling them in the direction because of how much these stupid things cost him. And this was only like a couple of weeks before he got arrested, but by the way, when he was rambling about My Little Pony, I think it was. Fantasy and fiction. You think that comic character wouldn't have its own thoughts and feelings? Chris questions Alec Benson Leary. No, Alec's response. You are naive, was Chris's response. By the time the internet had first discovered him, circa 2007, Chris already held beliefs that Quickville and his imaginary friends were real, and that he had the power to curse people. Since then, as a maladaptive coping mechanism for his real-world life crumbling all around him, Chris gradually took on larger-scale fantasies, such as parallel dimensions. For example, Quickville. Quickville is Chris's original vision of an imaginary and idyllic fantasy world, wherein everything is built around his comfort and convenience, and where he enjoys great power with scant responsibility. Chris believes that Quickville is real, and uses the city as a way to escape from a world that does not give Chris what he wants. Quickville was originally an ill-filled city within the state of Virginia, but it became part of the larger C-197 dimension when Chris started toying with the dimensional merge. All of Chris's characters are aware that Chris is the creator of their reality. Solitude and Rosechew both refer to him as father, in much the same way a Christian might consider God to be his or her creator. It is unknown, however, if the comic exists in the universe of Quickville. Chris believes his characters possess the free will to make their own decisions, and that he is not responsible for their actions. This is how various events, both major and minor, such as Sonichu and Rosechew's wedding, the birth of their children, Kel's romance with Nate Cirque, and even Bubbles and Blake's wedding, are said to actually happen off-screen, instead of just being a spur-of-the-moment throwaway plot elements that Chris usually does bring into these. That Chris is too lazy to depict, especially from like issue 10 onwards, then where Chris basically just completely lost all interest and just had giant walls of text. Without prior explanation, Chris made a spoiler in his own comic that Magi-chan will eventually get together with Sylvana, implying that, in Chris's head, this has already happened. It is Slowiel Ryan, not Chris, who apologizes for slandering Mary Lee Walsh. Chris wants to justify his refusal to write Simona out of the comic by saying that she would not want to leave Quickville, and that she and Wilde would fight for her right to stay. Madness. It literally reads of madness that Chris would not apologize for what he did to Mary Lee Walsh, and that suggesting that a character that wasn't his, that he refused to write out because for reasons that don't quite make sense, Simona declaring that she just wants to stay in Quickville. Chris considers everything drawn, written, or said about Quickville to be canonical if he's the one stating it, regardless of all the contradictions he makes, and feels it necessary to explain away undesirable changes to Quickville made as a result of outside influences, e.g. Billy Mays as the mayor. The fact that he needs to explain this in his comic pages shows that he assumes everyone else shares this belief as well. Despite considering his own judgment infallible as applied to his own work, he forces others to accept the contradictions, or corrections I should say, that he has made to theirs. When the Asperpedia 4 used systematic trolling to make Chris kill off the character Simona, Chris viewed it as a deliberate attack on his fantasy world. Quickville, which had always been Chris's way of retreating from the real world, had been infiltrated by outside forces and was no longer impenetrable. So this is likely why Chris put the comic on hiatus, to stop outside forces from causing any more damage. Again, it might be too late anyway, but, well, what can you do? This isn't my comic, this is Chris's. At one point, Chris's beliefs are such that even he claims to hold the distinction of mayor of Quickville in real life. That just about sums up the majority of things about where Chris really is in his mind, but we'll continue anyway. He only admits that Quickville is not real when he intends to pacify others he sees as too slow in the mind to comprehend this idea. He most likely defends this belief because he has accomplished and produced virtually nothing worthwhile in his life anyway. And he likes to pretend that he has made a positive impact on something, anything in his life, if only on a metaphysical level. In his opinion, anyone who does not accept this worldwide view is naive. Say it with me now. On the 23rd of July 2017, Chris responded to his true and loyal fan base who wondered why Chris wouldn't reboot his comics. As a response, Chris explained that if he were to reboot his comics, that would mean that history in the canon would have to start all over again, and all of the characters would have to start over with their original forms, or their original origin stories. Essentially, he thinks that if he pulls the plug on his Sonichu franchise and reboots it, that would mean that all of his characters would die and they would somehow reincarnate into their newer, upgraded versions. And Chris seems to think that's a bad thing, apparently. I believe in the alternate dimensions where each set or all of our animated characters reside and live their lives and continue growing long after the series is finished. Or stay kids, whatever. Chris 2 Doopy Do-Over. Yeah, this was like the first breaking into Chris's beliefs in things like the dimensional merge, and here we go. The moment I brought up the multiverse, he listened. The original idea guy on how he got Chris's attention. It's about as simple as that, apparently. Chris's belief in alternative dimensions enables him to disconnect from the poor and mundane life he currently resides in and to shift the responsibility over personality flaws to an alternative Chris. It gives him solace to believe that he, or other versions of himself, exist in other places, where he is content, successful, and surrounded by characters and people who love him. The idea guys exploited Chris's nascent beliefs and desires on other dimensions and further shaped them as part of their cult-like grip over his beliefs. The dimensional merge is Chris's ultimate escapist fantasy, enabling him to think he is a powerful and wealthy individual with real friends and a happy marriage, all just waiting for him on the other side of the dimensional curtain, a concept originally created by the idea guys and later expanded on by Chris with the help of fantasy enablers. The merge is his hope that the sister dimensions 1218 and C197 will unify, with him overseeing the merge in his role as the goddess CPU Blueheart. The dimension 1218, sometimes referred to as Earth 1218, is the dimension of reality. The dimension C197 is the designation for Chris's imaginary world, which contains all of his favorite fictional characters and OCs. The merge was originally scheduled to complete by the end of 2018, leaving behind a multiverse known as 1C-211987, with elements of both sister dimensions, and enables Chris to realize his dream of hanging out with Sonichu and his pals in reality. Which is never going to happen. I know that and you know that, but Chris never will admit to that. Imaginary friends. And one day, very soon, my family and I will be able to show ourselves to you all. Then you will be taking back your own schizo labels. Harumph! Chris vowing that we will see his characters in the flesh, and it still hasn't happened yet. When I look into the eyes of a original or fictional character, I do not see fiction at all. I see a fully living being, an individual. I see a friend of love or lover in few cases. Depending on which characters we're talking about, that has some pretty nasty connotations. Chris describing, however, how he sees his characters as real. In addition to Quickville, Chris's belief in imaginary friends is another major element of escapism. A mix of maladaptive coping and daydreaming, Chris believes that his characters actually exists in both C197 and 1218, and that he can communicate with them via meditation sessions. In reality, conflating his inner monologue with imagined visions and voices of his fictional friends. There are many instances of Chris trying to interact with imaginary friends over the years, becoming more prevalent over time, and his desire for escapism intensifies. Examples include his confrontation with Mary Lee Walsh in 2004, his imaginary dance partner at the 2017 BronyCon Gala, and social media messages near the end of the 2010s. Written either from a point of view of any of his OCs, or in which he claims to be with any one of them. In the fall of 2017, the idea guys roleplayed as Chris's own imaginary friends, giving Chris validation over his pre-existing notions and further fueling his maladaptive behavior, such as by convincing Chris that his imaginary friends will be united with him in the dimensional merge, and that he is married to several of them in a polyamorous marriage. Magical thinking. At this point, it's probably more wishful thinking, but let's ignore that for 1 second. Quite frankly, I believe you are wasting your time. There are more productive things in life than levitating a pen. You put your energy into those. Magician Uri Geller's advice for Chris, who had asked Yuri for help training his psychic powers. I am not wasting my time, Chris's reply. You know what, it's gonna... But that's maybe the other thing as well that's like hanging off like a lot of this article, is that it almost comes across as though, what if Chris woke up one day and literally the reality that he had wasted his entire life doing this? Do you think that would be too much for him to bear? So therefore he has to see this through to the end? Because I don't really think, truthfully, Chris believes in any of this. But he's trying to go as far as he can so that he can prove to people that it does exist. Chris's habit of magical thinking is another maladaptive coping method. manifesting in delusions of grandeur instead of putting in the effort to improve his own life. Chris prefers to believe that magic will do it for him. In addition, he believes that magic will allow him to neutralize his perceived enemies. I intend to do a lot more good with my psychic powers to bring peace and take down up to all of the internet haters and bullies. I need to do all these in my own control. So don't expect the police or the FBI or the CIA or, the Greene County Sheriff's Department to get involved, Chris. Except when it's concerning you specifically, about what you did. Chris believes he has an array of magic powers. Most notable is the ability to curse his enemies as well as to undo it. Others include communicating with the dead, brainwashing people, and psychic powers. Something only a crazy person would believe in. Meanwhile, superstitions. While most of Chris's superstitions are his own, he also takes part in popular superstitions as well. Autistic people in general tend to be predisposed to wishful and magical thinking, finding superstitions to be comforting. Chris dislikes the number 13 because he thinks it's an unlucky number. Trichastiophobia, the fear of the number 13, is already a common American superstition. With Microsoft Office, notably skipping version 13 during the development of Office 2010. However, Chris's fear of the number 13 had an unusual effect on the numbering of the Sonichu comics, where Sonichu 13 was numbered as Sonichu #12-9, showing his incompetency with either logic or math, and where the episode One Lucky Dog from episode 6 was labeled episode 12.5. Why do people think 13 is like it's bullshit? We know it's bullshit. Stop attributing things to that just don't work out that way. It's not funny or cute or clever. It's just stupid, ridiculous, bad. On Twitter, when going into multi-tweet rants, Chris numbers the tweets. For Twitter messages which exceed 12 tweets, Chris either replaces the number with 13 with a repeated 12 or with 12-9. Chris also shown his belief in astrology. He included his and Sarah Hammer's zodiac signs in the life shares. In his OkCupid, he wrote that he is a Pisces and it's fun to think about. He wrote to Jessica Quinn, I am emotional prone and I tend to do as I feel and life flows, like the Pisces I was born under. One of the quotes of his first Facebook was, I was born under the sign of Pisces, the sign of the provider. You gotta no, Chris, you're not the provider. You're not the provider. You're not even the pro. You're just the fucking idiot. I am fully capable of providing the necessities. No, you're not. And then some. No, for the unlucky woman who loves me for me, and becomes my true sweetheart. Well, people can dream, I suppose, but if that's the only thing I've got to say to that statement, then probably for the best that it didn't happen, eh? His belief in star signs may actually explain why he holds such a high significance to his birthday. Chris places significance on his birthstone, which he calls amethyst. He believes the class ring with the stone is what gives him power, and even pointed to it to Emily on their date. More recently, he has attached an amethyst quartz crystal to his medallion. Because that's the thing that Chris even needs now, more clutter. Like I said, he's becoming basically a one-man version of the game Buckaroo. In the real world, science and technology. I do not even know of the symptoms because, again, if I literally thought overnight about it, I would be at greater risk of infecting myself from reading and repeating the list in my mind. It's neurotypical and idiotic for anyone to do that and overthink it. And by the way, this is Chris rationalizing his ignorance of the COVID-19 disease. And bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, I spent 3 years working in a building specifically to fight off the pandemic. And guess what? I probably saved at least maybe 2,000 lives during my time doing it. And Chris thinking that he doesn't know the symptoms, so why on earth has he got to overthink something he doesn't even know? Chris seems completely unaware of what current technology is and is not capable of. In his solitary article on the Wikipedia, he suggests that Nintendo pour their resources in developing a Pokeball peripheral that would have slots for every generation of Pokemon games, including a slot for the GameCube memory card. He expects users of this peripheral to be able to read partly data from the inserted game or memory card, display a holographic image of the Pokemon in play, and challenge people in real life who own the same peripheral, in a manner much like on Yu-Gi-Oh! In addition, Chris has no idea how everyday machines such as cars work, evidenced in how he claimed that a 97 Cadillac with a cracked engine block was a great fixer-upper. No, that car's probably screwed. Normally, any serious physical damage to a car's engine can only be repaired by a very skilled mechanic, or cannot be repaired at all and one must buy a new engine, both of which are not cheap, but that's an entirely different problem. Chris has also been shown to lack knowledge of basic pathology. Where he contracted a cold in December 2019, he had misattributed it to the large-scale triggering that he got from a number of people on his Twitter. Yeah, and bear in mind as well, this was like just when the pandemic was only just beginning. Maybe Chris did get it and he was just ill. Maybe he was trolling us all this time. Oh dear, it's no, I don't think that would be possible. I don't think Chris is even bright enough or had the foresight to even do that. Social rules. Chris also obsesses over popular rules about relationships. Oh god, here we go again. He's held on to the idea that sex should be given on the third date, as well as other overly generic dating advice. Other rules Chris has culled from pop culture include superficial platitudes about decency, often expecting them to be valid in situations concerning others he has wronged. To name a specific example, besides emphatically claiming to be true and honest and requesting others forgive and forget, Chris once openly expressed a belief that learning morals about love and friendship, like franchises from My Little Pony and Care Bears, can prevent war. Woefully unaware that the real world and human beings are many more times more complex than what Chris is being portrayed as far as, in a cartoon aimed specifically for young children. Which means that probably Chris is either aged 10 years backwards, so he has the fortitude of a 5-year-old in a 42-year man's body. Again, you can work these things out, but Chris... It's a good thing Chris doesn't get into politics all that much because, well, despite the article in itself, there's still, I think he's more preoccupied with stuff like this. Conspiracy theories. I bet even Greene County had something to do with influencing that goddamn Michael Snyder to make him pretend to have a reason to kick me out. Chris blaming his school board for a decision made by a game store owner. Chris and his parents have come up with several conspiracy theories to explain away his life problems. Notable examples are Chris blaming his elementary school for keeping him in the autistic shell, his parents' notion that Michael Snyder and Megan Schroeder were masterminds behind the trolls, and Chris's belief that Snyder caused his own injuries when Chris and his mother hit him with their car. Estimation. A car weighs a lot more than 10 tons. Chris being unaware that most cars weigh anything up to roughly 1.5 to 3 tons, at least. Chris has a tendency to hugely exaggerate estimations of length, width, and strength in his favour, as evidenced in the depiction of a 12-pack can of lemonade as being 50 pounds or 22.7 kilos. This behaviour is a symptomatic of dyscalculia, a common symptom of autism, which leaves the sufferer with poor comprehension of time, measurement, or spatial reasoning. However, Chris does not really display any symptoms of it, suggesting this behavior isn't mere ignorance, but rather Chris telling childish lies to impress people about his physical strength. But where is it, though? Can you tell me? Lack of theory of mind. Chris has no idea on what the billions of people on the planet think. Or at least one person who wants to tell what we think of Chris, but we know what those probably are. He thinks that all men would happily wear bras and skirts. It must be noted, however, that Chris thought these ideas so that he alone would be more comfortable cross-dressing, and that every Sonic fan on the planet would support him in the Sonic Boom protests. When somebody informs him that they have a different opinion from him, he throws a tantrum and denounces that person as a troll. While autistic people have long been stereotyped with a lack of theory of mind, research into the double empathy problem proves that they don't necessarily lack it, though Chris definitely does. His actions speak for little, if any. Certainly not for me. Narcissistic tendencies. Here we go. Chris automatically assumes his lies will be believed, even if they contradict existing information. This is copiously evidenced in his constant lies during the father call, wherein Chris fibs incessantly about his health, among other things, frequently denying things or changing his story whenever he gets called out. His habit of lying and lying about his lies is likely inherited from his mother, who his brother described as a pathological liar. When asked by Evan to remove Simola from his comics, Chris decided that he could have created her without the inspiration of Evan's character Simonshu, and thus effectively had. The fact that he demonstrably could have done this and not factor into reasoning, Chris corrected Simola's Wikipedia entry with a retraction, denying that Simona had ever been inspired by Simonshu. Chris expected this, as the revised version of the truth would happily be accepted by all concerned parties. Needless to say, it wasn't. In addition to lies, Chris expects that any so-called apology will immediately change their minds of any perceived enemy of his, and everything will be sunshine and rainbows for him again. In fact, he believes this so much indeed that whenever he tries and does an apology video, he says it as though just saying the words are magic. He has done this many times before, but almost always not working out in his favour, especially considering his self-centered temperament and general nonchalant disregard for social etiquette are often what cause him trouble in the first place. Later on, however, he opted for a different approach in the form of contracts, in addition to unwittingly invalidating his own contract with a stipulation that store managers cannot hand him over to the police. He proclaimed that refusal to let an individual with a history of belligerent and disruptive behavior run amok in a retail setting would prove a manager to be most uncompassionate and lacking of heart and soul, even accusing them of potential discrimination simply because he identifies as an LGBT person. I wonder if Chris ever did have to pull that card out just to get his way. I'm not too sure, and I'm not too sure they would have just told him to go. Chris considers people with Asperger's syndrome to be fakers who are taking the shine and limelight away from genuine people such as himself, who have autism. Although Chris has admitted that this fact is only his idea, he still believes this. To think otherwise is to conform to blasphemy. As with many other things which antagonize him, Chris simply assumes Asperger's to be signs of a conspiracy targeting himself. With that sort of attitude, I'm surprised that Chris would have anybody left wanting to talk to him, because really? You really had to say stuff like that for no other... Why exactly would anybody say that anyway, just apart from trying to make themselves look good? newsflash, you don't when you do this stuff like that. Unsurprisingly, Chris came across as highly delusional when he expects to be taken seriously. For example, on the 28th of April 2012, he made an empty threat to the Kiwi Farms about hunting down each of its members. He claimed to know where each of them lived in an attempt to intimidate the trolls, even if one were to gloss over the fact that he wouldn't even cough up $800 to travel to Redmond to see his dreams come true. And it should be noted that there are trolls all over America, and indeed the world. There's a higher chance that this will only be one outcome of Chris actively pursuing his trolls, with the purpose of doing them harm. All things considered, Chris ended up making himself even more of a laughingstock in the process. Like many of his worst flaws, this contributed to the biggest mess Chris has ever gotten himself into. In July of 2021, Chris felt the need to confide in someone that he was shagging his elderly mother after previously lying that he was in an affair with an anonymous older woman. For this, he chose Bella, foolishly thinking he could trust her to keep the details secret. Despite Chris confessing to the illegal act of incest, having been informed by Noel she's an obvious troll and that she had suffered the consequences of oversharing public information multiple times for years. Needless to say, this caused a ruckus that ultimately led to Chris getting arrested. Though not, sent down for anything, because Chris, even to this day, is still pottering about as he likes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was everything you need to know about Chris and reality. So, any final thoughts about this? Once again, is this what happens when you decide to put too much stock into things that you know fine well are just not going to come true? Is this a subsidiary side effect of people who have autism in thinking that, as nice as it is to interact with the real world and, get to know more people, get to know the experiences that life has to offer, it's more interesting to stay in the confines of your own imaginations because life sometimes is too hard for some people? Or is there any moral whatsoever, and that perhaps, to be honest, maybe there isn't a moral to all this. Once again, maybe we're just a bunch of dumb, stinking idiots, and we're all doomed. The end. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you guys have enjoyed this reading, and I cannot wait to see all of you guys again when we discuss the core aspects of Chris's personality. So, thank all of you for watching, and take care, and bye-bye for now.